Welcome everyone to our little corner of the universe. Today is September 21st, and for this edition of Space Times Podcast, my name is Harrison Lambert. Here with Paul Mayer, we're going to talk about everything going on in the industry this week. Kick us off, we have a topic that we covered pretty intensively last week, but it continues to be a dominating force in our industry, and that has to do with next generation comm networks. This includes primarily low Earth orbit comm networks that are being built up to replace some of the more traditional existing geocom satellite networks. So think of companies like OneWeb, Starlink, and now there are a lot of competitors entering the market, mostly to compete with Starlink, who's had a strong foothold for years, but also to introduce some new technology and further improve these networks to not only fill in the gaps in our ground communications networks, but to actually improve our ability to communicate. This includes technology such as direct-to-device. So allowing a satellite to connect directly to your cell phone is a very, very new technology, and it's being explored intensively by several companies. We've seen this in some demos, but there's not been a large-scale deployment yet. That's looking like it's going to change. Just this week, we're seeing statements from Viasat, who one of the traditional geocom operators is partnering with Space 42, a smaller spacecraft producer, to launch a direct-to-device joint venture called Equitas. So they've signed an MOU in March to creating a platform that can take their part of this market and compete with other satellite providers that we're seeing go for the same sort of technology.
There's a couple of major players in the space, like we spoke about last week, and one of the big trends that we're seeing is a land grab, if you will, for spectrum. SpaceX bought $17 billion worth of spectrum from EchoStar. Very recently, Viasat and Space 42 are collaborating together in part to pool their spectrum resources so that they can have a bigger swing at the rapidly anticipated market that's going to be growing in the D2D space. And one of their primary goals is to try and get a head start on Starlink, who's going to be launching, I believe, in second half of 2026 for their demo in the D2D capability. And Equitas is trying to beat them to market effectively.
It's going to be hard to do with the EchoStar deal playing out the way it did. Buying the spectrum blocks that they did, I mean, they're already allocated for EchoStar, so it's not like Viasat was going to use that for anything. But now that they have that, they're able to pursue the D2D play a lot more efficiently. A lot of those satellite assets seem like they might already be ready to utilize that spectrum. It's not clear if they're going to need to make an update to the satellite platform. What they are announcing they're pursuing is a deal with chip makers to enable ground assets to be able to communicate with that network. So it might be just a factor of once they have the right chips and they have the spectrum license, devices on the ground can plug into the Starlink network. It would be interesting to see which companies they're partnering with for the chip manufacturing. Traditionally, it's companies like Qualcomm that have shown demos for this in the past, like with the Apple direct satellite connection a couple of years ago. So it might just be big players that Starlink is going to partner with. But most likely it's some publicly traded tech company that they're going to have to work with in deploying a technology that's going to be distributed widely to connect to their network. So EchoStar definitely gives them a head start. It sounds like it wouldn't surprise me if SpaceX has been planning for this for a while, but it looks like some of the pressure's on from other companies, and making this EchoStar deal helps them kind of cut the line and make them move faster. So we'll see how Viasat's able to catch up. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if other companies similarly are trying to approach the same market, because we're seeing other traditional geocom operators like Telesat and SES make new announcements about their LEOcom constellations. And with them being decently far out, at least a year or two, which, in space time, that's probably going to be longer, they'll have time to work in some of this technology for D2D.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the D2D tech stack winds up getting incorporated into upcoming and ongoing satellite constellation networks. I know that Equitas and Viasat and Space 42 are focused on trying to win some of that, like you were saying, some of that platform layer, providing customers, connecting customers with open spectrum, partnering with the people who own the spectrum, and taking their cut in that stage of the market and that horizontal slice of it. And at the same time, they're trying to effectively provide a one-stop shop to connect terrestrial and multi-orbital infrastructure. So all of this to say that Viasat and Space 42 are positioning themselves to try and win market share via a cost leadership strategy. And it'll be interesting to see how the other players in the space, like Starlink or some of the others that we're seeing, Telesat or SES, it'll be interesting to see how this figurative, I guess, standards war winds up playing out. Typically, a standards war is a winner take all scenario. Given the high level of fragmentation throughout the entirety of the space industry, I would be surprised if we see that type of uniformity at any stage of the supply chain.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how much consolidation and how much monopolistic power one of these players is able to leverage once they start to gobble up market share and start to maintain a level of defensibility to their market share.
Yeah, it sounds like Equitas wants to push for a sort of consortium of space layer assets where they want to be agnostic to kind of what network they're tapping into on orbit. And I guess that sounds nice in theory, but what we're seeing play out across geopolitical like interactions is that most countries want to be independent. So I find it hard to believe that Viasat would be able to combine forces. It makes sense that they would try to do that to compete against Starlink, and no single network is going to be able to be, as robust as that. So partnering together could provide unique value, but I just don't see it happening, especially with security concerns about having a layer of communications be, able to switch from one to the other. For commercial reasons, it could be useful, but again, I could see countries being concerned that their population is using a foreign asset, and something that could be hacked for elections or hacked for surveillance, or have foreign interference in such a proliferated technology.
There's definitely an increasing level of concern for security and defense purposes regarding the sufficiency and independence of each sovereignty's space capabilities, including the hardware, the networking, and the operating software for those communications tech stacks.
Yeah.
To that point, there's been a sizable report release that I'm sure we'll get the chance to get into in more detail later, but the Redshift report that went live or was published earlier this week hits on a lot of those concerns and highlights a lot of the trends that we're seeing in that vein.
Yeah, and I think it kind of lines up with what we're seeing with the Europe's IRIS² program. It looks like European sovereignty is driving them to move away from other people's communication platforms. That won't be available till 2030, though, which is why looks like Telesat is working on a solution in the interim to launch a constellation next year to provide that sort of LEO constellation of communication for Europe to try to get them away from Starlink. Now, they're only planning to launch 198 LEO satellites, and the way LEO orbits work is you can't really target a specific area, so it's going to be relatively region. It's going to be across a certain latitude. It wouldn't surprise me if they only operate in Europe if that's the goal of it. But since Telesat's a private company,
yeah, it'll be neat to see how Lightspeed fills the need of Europe's IRIS² capability. Granted, the timelines that we're looking at here, I think Lightspeed is conservatively targeting a mid-2027 launch for their live capability. And IRIS²'s earliest availability will be, I think, that same window in 2030. So under the best circumstances, Telesat needs to make their entire business model viable if they're only going to be operating at capacity for 3 years, which seems really challenging to do for such a capital-intensive industry, to be able to amortize and commoditize all of that hardware and all of that manufacturing expense into just 3 years of operation before the headlining band comes on, so to speak.
Yeah, and if the purpose of IRIS² really is space sovereignty, I don't see them being able to use Lightspeed to kind of flow into IRIS². Like, it's not going to be an expansion of Lightspeed. I mean, Telesat's a Canadian company, so like building a constellation with them doesn't really solve their space sovereignty problem. And I haven't seen anything that says IRIS² is going to be built by them. So it makes sense, given all of Europe's push to fund their own space companies, that sort of program would be a European company to build it. And so it really just seems like Telesat is kind of a placeholder, best they can do right now, since Telesat's been pursuing LEO constellations for years now. And they've already put a couple satellites up since like 2021 as demo satellites. So the technology works. It's more the investment they need to put that up, and the opportunity to make their money back hasn't really been there until potentially now. But 3 years to make back the price of 200 satellites seems like a slight risk.
Yeah, I think the typical expected operating lifespan for your standard LEO satellite, 100 kilogram to 500 kilogram asset class, I believe, is 3 to 5 years. So the mentality could entirely be that Telesat wants to service this need, use it effectively to pay for the capital expense of getting their constellation up and functioning, and then effectively sell their capacity and their capability to whomever is buying for the tail end of their product's life cycle. And the intent could very much be that the product market fit of the IRIS stopgap effectively could very well just be a proof of concept. Effectively, hey, we're going to build this capability, build this stopgap need, and while we're doing that, our customers will be able to see that we're actively solving this problem. We've de-risked everything that we've done. We've solved all the problems that we need to solve. And so even if this IRIS customer effectively doesn't renew, we'll still be able to sign enough new contracts to where this is a net positive for Telesat. But I'm in agreement with you that I certainly don't think that contract is going to renew, given the trends we've already discussed about the desire for independence and sovereignty, and the mismatch between Telesat and Europe is already there. But
It
should be.
Yeah. No, I was going to say the business deal, like if they structure it the right way, it could make sense to what you're saying. Like, the technology is part of the demonstration. If whoever is going to build IRIS² or just Europe in general owns the IP for whatever technology they're flying, or that's some sort of shared IP, like, they would benefit long term when it comes to building their own constellation. But if Telesat still owns the constellation, they can continue making money off of it. I don't hear anything that says that IRIS² is the only network that you can use in Europe. It's just sounds like they want to have own themselves.
I guess if I were to consolidate my point, I would say that I think the Lightspeed constellation can be successful if its success is not predicated upon Europe renewing contracts.
So as you pointed out, like these satellites, they don't last very long. Like they're in LEO, they're a few hundred kilograms, they're going to deorbit. If this contract's just for the 198 satellites, they'll probably last the lifetime of the contract, the 3 years between 2027 to 2030 when Iris is ready. So, it's probably a very targeted contract, but that's one of the main downsides to these LEO constellations. They have to constantly replenish. So the balance of profit from operation to the cost of continuing to replenish your assets is kind of a tight balancing act. That still is an issue. I mean, Starlink solves it by just mass volume that I haven't seen any other company approach. But there's other solutions to kind of get around this balancing act that we see in this market, which is putting satellites higher. And that might seem counterintuitive because the whole point of going to LEO constellation is to get away from traditional geo solutions for communications. But we're starting to see more and more companies that are finding a balance between the two. One of the more interesting ones this week was SES, who again, like Telesat Viasat, is a traditional geocom operator, but they're proposing a very novel solution that I haven't seen before, which is to build a medium Earth orbit satellite. And medium Earth orbits, like very sparse, barely anybody operates there. I mean, pretty much everybody's in LEO. There's a bunch of geocoms in GEO, hence the name. But medium Earth orbit is pretty much just GPS satellites and weather satellites.
Yeah, MEO orbit basically locks you in to an order of magnitude more expensive asset with 80 to 90% of the operational capability of something in GEO. So traditionally, it's been a very narrow use case for the value added by a MEO satellite in MEO orbit, just because you can do everything you're going to do in MEO so much cheaper with a LEO constellation. Or if you really need something that's absolutely higher quality, higher fidelity, you're not going to be able to get the absolute best cutting edge market product from MEO. So it's an interesting trade-off. The way that SES has partnered with K2 to do this has been to contract out effectively a multi-orbit asset, meaning that they're actually going to launch their assets into a LEO orbit. So they're getting that LEO price point for the asset itself, for the launch price, for the development of the asset. They're launching into LEO and then elevating and escalating its orbit into that of a MEO bird. Yeah. I believe the trade-off is a 35% of the fuel budget more or less gets allocated to that climb. So there's some expense there, we'll call it. There's some loss in value in the fact that you have to allocate a third of your fuel just to the climb there. But the cost arbitrage in designing a LEO asset or a LEO bird versus needing to design from the ground up a MEO bird, that meaningfully changes a lot.
Well, that's what makes it interesting that they're partnering with K2, because honestly, I don't know what other company would make this possible, like financially feasible. Because K2, I mean, their goal is to build really, really large satellites, like oversized for our current launch vehicle market. I mean, they're depending on Starship becoming the norm, or at least becoming, frequent enough that they can hitch a ride with their satellite, because that's the kind of size we're talking about. I mean, the benefits and the reason their company exists is that you scale that large, things can become cheaper, less specialized. I mean, they're building their own vertical stack for a lot of the components, so they can bring that cost down by scaling up. And in a lot of cases, they're over designing, but they're bringing the cost down by by just standardizing a larger bus. And so when you kind of combine that with the point of a MEO orbit, is that if you're in MEO, you don't need as many satellites as if you're in LEO. Your orbits process less slowly or less quickly, and you don't need as many satellites to cover your kind of latitudinal region. So there's a different balance going on there, which is that you have fewer satellites. They don't deorbit, but they cost more because you need more fuel and you need more mass, and you just need more payload. But that trade-off is skewed slightly because what traditionally we count as huge cost sinks, like mass, like payload, like fuel, are not as significant with the K2 platform, at least in theory. They haven't launched yet, and they've launched demos, but they haven't launched their flagship product yet. And so all this is relatively speculative. But it'll be a very cool use case for it if it works out, if the trade-off makes sense. Having more satellites in medium Earth orbit would be great. I mean, it's like I said, it's sparse. Even if we put as many satellites as we did in LEO in medium Earth orbit, it would still be better because we would congest the low Earth orbit even less, and that's starting to be a huge problem. Just with Starlink alone, is having tens of thousands of satellites flying around so close to Earth. It's the densest part of our orbit. It's where things are most likely to collide with each other, and if they do, they'll block out our access to space in general. So moving these satellites out to medium Earth orbit, decreasing the number of them, I mean, it just seems great all around. If the trade-off works, this seems like an awesome solution.
Yeah, I agree. I think K2's progress in solving these technical problems is going to be really indicative of the way the market winds up going. Traditionally, we've seen geo orbit birds and assets being the only viable solution. More recently, we've seen LEO capabilities rapidly advance to the point where for 10% of the cost of a geospatial asset, you're able to get 60% of the product effectively. And it'll be interesting to see how that trend towards proliferation and smaller, more expendable, cheaper assets winds up, I'll say, slowing as these mid-size vehicles and mid-Earth, MEO orbits. But these mid-size vehicles and MEO orbits wind up becoming more financially viable.
Yeah, and even geo is having sort of renaissance. I mean, again, if medium Earth orbit gets you further away, decrease the number of satellites you need. Obviously, that's the point of geo. It's why it's been so useful for so long. For geocom, it's just parking a satellite in a geostationary orbit where it can sit over one location on Earth all the time. Simplifies operations significantly, simplifies the payload design, the technology. You don't have to worry about handing off from one satellite to the other. A satellite just sits there. But the reason they've always costed hundreds of millions of dollars is because they're so big, they're so bespoke, the amount of fuel to get out there and the supporting subsystems to get out there is just so costly that it's a huge money sink that takes years to regain through profits. It's been on the out as a solution for comms as these LEO constellations are proliferating. But we're seeing some solutions up here that sort of mitigate all the downsides to geo that we've been seeing. I think a lot of these are driven by commoditization of subsystems and improvement in technology. Your propulsion systems have improved significantly over the years. Mass saving systems are great. Solar panels have gotten a lot better, so reducing mass there has been awesome. And so we're seeing a lot of companies that are proposing small geocom satellites. We're talking like 1,000 kilograms or less, or at least in that range, as compared to several ton hulking $100 million geocom satellites that we've seen traditionally.
$100 million geocom satellite is a bargain.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've seen close to $1 billion satellites for these kind of use cases.
I think
And so,
Jupiter 3 was 600 million, wasn't it?
yeah, and it had to launch on a Falcon Heavy, which is not cheap. I mean,
But it did launch. We got it up there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was great. Like, it was an awesome feat of engineering, but it was very specific to the payload. The bus had to be modified to get there. I mean, if the goal is to be less than $1 billion, I have high hopes for K2.
A damning endorsement if I've ever heard one.
I mean, a lot of these other like small geo providers, if they can meet a fraction of the capability of a large geocom satellite, and it's just a matter of placing enough of them in orbit that you can have that same capability, then the economics of it work out. In fact, it works out not in just a linear fashion in that, if one of these small geocom satellites is a tenth the capability of a traditional geocom satellite, it's not just launch 10 of them, and as long as it's cheaper to buy 10 than one of the larger ones, then you're net positive. It's also the fact that you're building 10 of these satellites, so you start getting economies of scale and that commoditization of those subsystems. So having these kind of solutions start to grow in popularity is going to only help over time. And we've seen that with Astranis. They've been around for a while now. They've had some great contracts, but we're also starting to see other companies come into that space, such as Swiss 212 had announced this week that they wrapped up their preliminary design review for Singapore's NeStar satellite, planning to launch in 2027. So hopefully we start seeing more of these small geo solutions coming out. I mean, having a variety of solutions for the ground communications issue is great. I mean, we don't want to stick to just one solution. They all have their benefits. Having a trade-off between them is good. I mean, this has been the conversation around most of this is we want options. We don't want to be locked into one solution, not just in which company to use, but in which region to use, which type of satellite, which comms solutions.
Agreed. Fragmentation in a market, a whole bunch of discrete, separate, different piecemeal solutions to solving some of the bigger problems. Ultimately, that market is generally going to be a little bit more expensive than if everything is commoditized and streamlined and it's all cookie cutter the same thing over and over and over. But the fragmented, discrete one with 100 different people solving 1,000 different problems, that market is going to be indescribably more resilient than the monolithic one where everything is homogenized. So you and I are in complete agreement that seeing a lot of different types of solutions here is good news for the space industry.
Yeah, and then to the sovereignty point, like space security is another big issue, and having satellites in multiple spatial domains protects your system even better. With a weapon that can take out a solution that's sitting in low Earth orbit is not going to be able to take out a solution that's sitting in geo orbit. The whichever bad actor is trying to attack your assets on orbit is going to have to come up with multiple solutions, and it just makes that effort that much harder. So
right,
having some hybrid of these solutions, having all these solutions, it's a great approach. And even having a variety in the way that they communicate is great. Like, we're starting to see more and more use case for laser terminals instead of just traditional RF communication. And normally those laser terminals have been used for things like Earth communications, but we're starting to see it far more often in space-to-space communications between satellites to create a network. Laser terminals obviously have a higher, faster throughput for data, so being able to transfer that between satellites, up in orbit where there's no air, is very useful.
right.
We've seen it on other satellites. Most recently, we've seen it on the York space deployment for the tracking layer Tranche 1. It looks like just this week or last week, they launched 16 satellites to deploy the initial distribution for that TLT-1 to orbit. And so that's a defense contract to build up the communications layer for missile tracking. From the pictures I've seen, it looks like they have high gain patch antennas, which makes sense to communicate down to the ground. But they've also got 4 laser terminals on board each satellite, which, to create a network between multiple satellites, you need at least 3 laser terminals to establish connection and maintain it. So 4, probably for redundancy. That's a lot of laser terminals. And we talked about last week with the AeroVironment deal at around 250 million, selling that many laser terminals. I was thinking it might be York Space, but it looks like it's actually Mynaric who's supplying York Space, which, great for Mynaric. They're having a rough go of it lately, but, selling as many terminals, it's 4 times 16 just for this first round. They're going to continue supplying plenty of laser terminals for future deployments, assuming York Space's solution works for the government.
That's a huge update. Congratulations to them. I had missed that one. That's awesome. One of the big themes that I'd heard repeatedly from some of the conference circuit this year was the need for solving the delay, solving the time-lapse challenge, the lag time challenge in getting insights down to Earth from orbit, and 100 different ways to cut this cake. But one of the key components to that is reliable, accurate, trustworthy, space-based optical relay. And it's interesting to hear that this is already starting, that we're already starting to see some on-orbit optical relay get implemented. Traditionally, the reason we haven't seen that is that the optical relays are pretty mass and volume intensive. So it's great to hear that Mynaric has solved those problems well enough to where the mass budget and volume budget are worth the trade-off, or that in addition to some of the technical problems they've solved with the optical relay itself, they've also managed to hit new lows in the mass and volume budgets to help really reduce the opportunity cost of getting those optical relay terminals on board. Similarly, I guess on the ground station side, there's the news coming out of out of World Space Business Week in Paris. There's the news regarding Kai Labs.
Yeah. Off the back of the Kepler demo.
Yeah, I believe they partnered with Kepler for that demo, right?
Yeah. To do a space to airplane communications using a laser terminal.
Yeah, that's pretty intense.
Yeah. I mean, they raised 66 million off of that demo, which congratulations to them. I mean, it was a great demo.
I think it's 66 million US. I think it's closer to 54 million euros. Something like that. But they've raised a healthy sum off the back of their tech demonstration.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why they did it to an airplane. Honestly, like, you shave off a few kilometers in altitude, but having a moving platform just makes it hard. I mean, the main
if you're
thing,
able to solve it, if you're able to solve the harder problem, they'll be able to solve the simpler problem.
I guess so. I
So
mean,
from the investor perspective, if you're able to do it, that's an easy win.
Yeah, it's odd because I haven't seen them report that they could communicate to the ground. So, I mean, if they communicate to a plane, they should be able to communicate to the ground. I mean, as you get close to the ground, the atmosphere gets thicker, the distortions get higher. That causes a lot of problems for laser communications. So maybe a couple kilometers really can make the difference there. So we'll see what they do with their technology. But just the fact that they can get information down, a lot of what we're talking about with this D2D sort of market that's getting hotter and hotter is how proliferated it can be. But one of the biggest obstacles that's yet to be overcome is the data throughput. And we have low latency networks. They exist. Inmarsat's already got pretty much global coverage with satellite coverage. Starlink has it, but there are limits to how much data they can push down through traditional RF paths. They might get better. Starlink's talking about having higher throughput through, tricks with RF. Like you could probably modulate differently. You can add more bandwidth. You can go across spectrum, but those are regulated things. So there are limits that aren't just physics. But when it comes to light, you can transmit a lot of data. Suddenly, the throughput issue isn't a problem anymore. The problems are more technical. They're like, how do you stabilize the platform? How do you calculate for atmospheric distortion? How do you handle, like you said, the mass? These are like 15-kilogram gimbal devices on board of a platform that needs to be able to manage multiple of them moving around independently. So there's a lot of problems to solve here. I mean, it doesn't really solve problems direct to device in terms of high throughput, but it's a big piece in getting us to a point where we're able to communicate with high throughput all the time to space assets.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I'm most excited about is I'll say, proliferation of terrestrial infrastructure, by which I mean we've seen a lot of orbital infrastructure going up. We know that there are already plans for mega constellations. I'll point to Amazon's Kuiper as one example. We've got already a couple of mega constellations on orbit that are space-to-space relay, space-to-space handoff constellations, but they're much lower throughput, much lower, smaller amounts of data that they can handle at any point. And I'm excited to see a similar level of infrastructure and capability developed terrestrially so that we're not stuck to ground stations that are where they are. I think a lot of the excitement around Kai Labs more explicitly is that they're proving out the capability of being able to find and provide a reliable ground station network that's almost geography agnostic. Point being, great, we've got a plane that's in a certain area or certain location. We'll be able to relay information through that plane to a different ground station network that's nearby, but little bit further outside of the orbital asset's reach. So there's some increasing excitement for that level of capability as the total number and total amount of assets and data throughput, only assets on orbit and the data throughput need of those assets is only expected to continue to accelerate.
Yeah. And going back to variety and solutions, like having K-Labs pursue this option is great, because we can have things like hybrid solutions where it's not even just we can only do low Earth orbit, we can only do medium Earth orbit. We can combine these things. Like low Earth orbit constellations can interact with geocom satellites. Like they solve some of the problems. Like you can get away with not having a laser terminal to connect all your low Earth satellites if you can communicate up to a geo satellite that can see you all the time. And it's basically GPS works. It's just more of a one-way low throughput system. Then if this is really possible to communicate from LEO to Earth assets, up flying around, then we can start seeing more possibility in using high altitude platform systems. Things like the Loon project that came out of Google years ago, or some of the newer companies like Alto, Aerostar, SCI, talking about using high altitude balloons or planes or some sort of persistent platform that can float high in the air.
The pseudo satellite solutions.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And if we can use a laser terminal to communicate to those balloons, you handle the throughput. You don't get as much attenuation of data volume through the atmosphere with lasers, or just you have so much throughput that you can lose more and still not be impacted. And then the last mile solution from those balloons to the ground, then you don't have as much attenuation from the atmosphere. You can use, high power RF solutions at that point, and maintain as much of that throughput as you can by implementing this sort of hybrid solution.
Makes
So
sense. Makes sense. Just as an aside, between the two of us, you're the Frenchman. So I sure hope you're pronouncing Kylabs correctly because I'm just following your lead.
no, I'm saying it in Spanish.
Okay, so we're fine.
Yeah,
We're fine.
cover our bases.
That's right. We should be as diverse and fragmented in our pronunciation as we aspire for the space industry to be. One of the other trends that we've seen developing and furthering is, to that end, a proliferation of new availabilities and new options for launch providers. More specifically, we've seen a handful of different startups and satellite companies over the past week or so announce contracts signed and MOU signed and launch capability committed from non-SpaceX launch providers. Hubble Network, I think, is launching with Muon. There's Infinite Orbits that's going to be launching with Impulse Space. And then both Astra and Arianespace are actively looking at increasing their capacity for launch over the next 2 to 3 years, I believe.
Yeah.
But point being that there's some definite tailwinds to additional launch providers gaining some traction. What used to be a super saturated market just 10 years ago is looking once again to have a lot of room and a lot of availability for additional players to provide different launch solutions.
Yeah, I mean, what's the point of beating Starlink if you're just paying SpaceX? Like, gotta find a solution elsewhere. And it looks like a lot of these small launch companies that have been around for years trying to compete with SpaceX are having a sort of a comeback. I think just the volume that we're starting to see in space contracts, we're moving away from one-off demo missions and we're starting to see much larger deals for full-on constellations. There's going to be higher demand for launch vehicles. And I think that puts it on the existing launch providers. If they're reporting on Muon and Impulse is true that they're going to be providing launch, that'd be pretty huge. I'm sure plenty of platform providers at one point I thought about becoming launch providers, and that's how you vertically integrate in that sort of market. But there's a lot of companies like Astra or Firefly, even like this big one, Rocket Lab's been launching, so it's not really like they're pursuing that. But there's the other companies that are really starting to get a foothold, or starting to make their comeback with their technology. They're able to compete. We're even seeing that internationally with ISAR and Avio. They're getting large funding rounds, like 400 million for Avio to help, 400 million euro, so even higher in USD, for them to start developing launch capabilities for Europe. And even just this last week, ESA is finally starting to look into reusable rockets. They had been very reluctant for a long time. For some reason, thinking that's not the solution after SpaceX has been doing it for like a decade. And so now they're starting to look into that with their space providers that work on the Ariane rocket.
I mean, it's great to see all of this innovation in the space. It's great to see all of this momentum for the industry. I mean, SpaceX effectively has been the monopoly on cost leadership to date. So a cost leadership strategy more or less means that you're going to provide the product at the cheapest possible cost. Nobody else is going to be able to provide it cheaper than you are, which we look at SpaceX, that's very much the case. For their rideshare program, nobody else is going to be able to come close to that. However, SpaceX has either intentionally or accidentally exerted a lot of monopolistic power over the space. Effectively, they've really artificially limited supply. So if you and I high five and we say, great, we're going to launch a satellite tomorrow, we call up SpaceX, we're already on I believe a 18 to 36 month wait list.
Yeah.
So just from a sheer cost of capital perspective, that 2 year on average, we'll call it a 2 year, but that straight up 2 year timeline, that waiting period is a huge killer for anybody trying to innovate in the space. So having these other players who are, well, we're not going to be able to get you the same cost as SpaceX. We're going to be more expensive than a bus ticket, but we can pick you up. We can give you a ride. You can still call a cab effectively rather than need to take the bus downtown. So it's really exciting to see Rocket Lab, Firefly, Neon Space, the other folks who are providing launch in this space, to see all of these different players intentionally growing and increasing their capacity, because we can all see which way the wind is blowing. We can all see that the demand for launch is rapidly outpacing its supply availability. And some folks might argue that that's some short-sightedness maybe, but some folks might argue that that's been a mistake that SpaceX has made, has been not continuing to address and gobble up that demand, not keeping their supply scaling with that growth of demand, because now they have a lot of competition in the space. And there's a lot of other bespoke, more mid-sized, less cost leadership. I think SpaceX is ballpark of 4,000 a kilogram for their ride share. Yeah. And some of the other players are closer to 10,000 a kilogram for their bespoke launch. So it's more expensive, but you are able to get it. You're able to get it in 6 weeks rather than 6 months, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think cadence continues to be the biggest challenge for most of these companies. I mean, Blue Origin is complaining about the difficulty of getting from 1 launch to 100. They can't even get to 10 launches, and they're arguably one of the furthest along. I think Firefly, Rocket Lab are very promising as well. I think Rocket Lab's only had tens of launches in total, but SpaceX is up there doing hundreds of launches a year, and there's still not enough to provide.
They're doing more launches by almost an order of magnitude than the rest of the market combined, and there's still silly folks like me out here saying that they're constricting supply.
Yeah, I mean, if you're already at hundreds of launches, what's stopping them from going to thousands of launches? If that's really what the market's demanding, what are the factors here? I mean, we've got component supply, but they're relatively well integrated vertically. Spaceports can only launch so much. I mean, we've seen plenty of scrubs due to weather. So, sure. The people changing their schedules, I'm sure, screw stuff up, but I've yet to see the SpaceX launch scrub because somebody pulled their payload, unless it was some sort of dedicated launch. So I'm just wondering, is it really that hard for SpaceX to scale from hundreds to more hundreds? And is it really easier for all these other companies to scale from 1 to hundreds like SpaceX and just have multiple launch providers that can operate hundreds of launches a year?
So the challenges of going 1 to 100 are different than the challenges of going 100 to 1,000. There's absolutely challenges there. So those are both valid questions. I think we've seen 1 to 100 already be solved. So personally, I'm more optimistic that Rocket Lab and Firefly and Astra and Arianespace, that I'm more optimistic that they will be able to solve those same problems that we've already seen solved, then we'll see somebody solve entirely new problems that we've not yet seen solved. We've never seen somebody hit thousands of launches, that order of magnitude, in a year. And so the point is that I think it'll be more likely a shorter path to increased capability and increased capacity to see other people effectively copy SpaceX than for SpaceX to break new ground and do something totally different that allows them to then launch 4 or 5 times what they're currently launching. If that makes any sense. But it's any sort of pressure, any competitive pressure that SpaceX is able to feel is good for the industry. It signals a lot of good things.
Yeah, bringing the cost down of launch. I mean, SpaceX has brought it down a lot. Starship should bring it down further. You know, it'd be funny to see if SpaceX starts feeling price pressure right as they're able to start flying Starship, because then they'll be back in the clear again. Like nobody's going to compete with Starship for a long, long time.
Yeah. Well, the price pressure is likely not going to be the way in which SpaceX feels pressure. So it's not going to be because somebody else is able to launch this, that, or the other for cheaper than SpaceX. That's likely never going to happen. The pressure that SpaceX is likely to feel is that folks who are capable of launching on their satellites are impatient or incapable of waiting for the 2-year to 3-year window where they would be able to launch. So SpaceX would feel pressure from not being able to meet timelines rather than not being able to meet budgets.
Yeah, I think the big factor I see often is the orbits to which Falcon 9 is going to. And unless you buy your own rocket, you don't really get to pick where you're going. And even if you did buy the whole rocket, Falcon 9 is only able to access certain orbits, given the launch pad, given the fuel capacity. And most satellites, at least these days, are going to low Earth orbit, and most of the low Earth orbit satellites are going into sun-synchronous orbit. Very useful for observation. Very congested area.
Yep.
There's a lot of orbits that are underutilized, and as we're talking about these new solutions starting to use medium Earth orbit more and geo orbit more, we're starting to look at, well, does this mean you need different rockets that access different orbits? Do you need to put launch pads where you are able to access those orbits? Do you need to over-design the rockets so you have enough fuel to get there? And so for a few years now, the proposed solution has been space tugs, where the satellite gets launched on a rocket into a standard orbit with everyone else, but then some attached satellite to the real satellite, the payload satellite, is going to move you into the orbit you want to be in. There's been not a lot of movement in this market. The value is not really there. Again, everybody wants to be in sun-synchronous orbit. Why go to another orbit when that one works? It works for most every application. And so all the space tug companies haven't really been used much. And the ones that have flown have kind of shown that the cost efficiency for power or for fuel and mass budget doesn't really make sense in most cases. You might as well just have a bigger rocket. You're basically paying for that. Your satellite's a bit more efficient because it's using a plasma thruster, but you can use chemical thrusters and get there faster, like a second stage does on a rocket.
Magnitude of demand currently, the vast majority of demand currently being for these LEO sun-synchronous orbits, and knowing that there is an increase in demand across the board for sort of everything, how do you view the market sort of developing and shaking out over the next few years? Do you think that the space tug industry is going to stick the landing and find its footing, so to speak? Or do you think that there's going to be other problems, or rather other solutions that wind up solving the same or similar problems? Do you think we're going to see more bespoke launches rather than just the SpaceX cost leadership? Do you think Rocket Lab is going to start catering to MEO orbits, and Firefly is going to start catering to non-sun synchronous orbits, or what have you? Share your thoughts a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, the space tug ecosystem is not particularly profitable because most satellite providers they already have a bus provider, and the bus provider is going to figure out how to get you to the right orbit and operate in that orbit. And when you have these kind of two-phase missions where one satellite is getting you where you need to go and the other is operating you once you're there, it just overcomplicates things usually. Mm-hmm. We haven't really seen that, particularly for LEO. Like I said, there's nobody that wants to go to bespoke orbits, so there's not enough market there to capture. But the defense industry does have interest in being able to move around. Usually not to place a satellite, but more so to go tag up with another satellite, whether it's to, break it as a military exercise or attach something to it. Refueling has been a big interest for a while, but refueling is such a far technology out. I mean, there's some satellites that do it, but again, mostly for defense companies that can afford it, because in the past it's been cheaper to just launch a new satellite than to refuel one. So it really started becoming a solution that only makes sense when you start talking about larger on-orbit systems, interplanetary travel. I mean, the thing with Starship is like it can't get to Mars without a refueling ecosystem. So
Right.
we'll see that ecosystem start to be profitable on Starship's launch. You know, it's kind of a add-on market that doesn't exist right now, but it should once we're at that stage. And I would expect it to start growing then. But in the meantime, the companies that kind of came in too early don't really have anything to make money off of. And a lot of them are pivoting to get to defense contracts, but those take a long time as well to close. And so what I'm finding interesting right now is that we have companies like ExoTrail. So they have an option, but they've only flown it like once. And it sounds like they're going to fly it again next year with fairly few modifications. So it's the same kind of market. But the fact that over like several years, they've only flown two, and there's probably not a market there. I can't imagine when the market would be there. Like we're talking about these low Earth orbit constellations. They're dropping out of orbit constantly and being replenished. Like that's just come to be the accepted solution. So why is a satellite going around, moving them around, refueling them, like handling your constellation? It just adds more complexity. The one that I find interesting is that Impulse Space has a deal with, I believe, Infinite Orbits and Anduril to work on a geo transfer system. So having a satellite that pushes another satellite out to geo and then detaches and does its own thing, that's a lot more interesting use case. The market's a lot smaller, but it actually makes sense for a lot of reasons. We already see these kind of two-phase operations for geo satellites. They have a transfer mode where they operate as one type of satellite, and then they get to geo, and then they switch into like geostationary mode. But when they're in one mode, they're not using any of the systems of the other mode, and when they're in that other mode, they're not using any there. So the satellite gets really over-designed, and you're spending, if we're talking hundreds of millions, you're spending hundreds of millions on wasted technology, like wasted hardware that's only used for like a few months as you get out to that orbit, while as the rest of it has to last for like 15 years. So there's that imbalance of one space provider has to design two very different spacecraft and then mesh them together. But if you have a solution like Impulse sounds like they're providing, Impulse can design this low lifetime, high efficient transfer vehicle, which is what they've been working on, is a transfer vehicle, while whoever they're providing it to can focus on their long lifetime geocom satellite. So there's a good relationship you can build there between two companies, and it sounds like that would be a good use case for it. And again, like having to get out to geo, you're kind of over designing your transfer vehicle, so it should work for LEO. And if it's over designed, like what does the Defense Department care? They want over designed satellites. They want big, large, massive satellites with huge power and large fuel. Like they're willing to pay. So that's not the issue.
Right.
So this seems like a really good approach for Impulse.
No, it makes sense. I mean, I think fundamentally, if it's cheaper to build and launch a new satellite than it is to refurbish or relocate or replenish or refuel the existing satellite, you're not going to do that, right? Like if these LEO satellites are built to be as expendable as they are, if they're intended to be as short-lived and as rapidly replaced as we're already seeing, makes perfect sense that the tug industry would just not find overlap there. But it also makes sense that the other side of that equation, the geo birds, the MEO birds, the much more expensive, much bigger satellites that want to do one thing really, really well, but currently have to do multiple things, it makes perfect sense that they would want to be able to let somebody else come along and solve those second and third order challenges that they've needed to solve internally, so that they can just focus on their own payload and operating for the 10 to 20 year life cycle that these traditional geobirds want to operate at.
again, if it's the Defense Department we're talking about that wants these kind of things, like they've already got solutions. There's not really a gap to be filled. Like the X-37B has been flying for over a decade now. We don't hear much about it because it's top secret space plane, but they wouldn't keep using it if it wasn't doing what it was supposed to, which is to go tag up with other satellites or use like move around to custom orbits and place satellites where they need to be. So in terms of space tug, that's pretty much what it is. It's called a space plane, but that's effectively what it's doing. And we've got it with like Northrop Grumman's MEV, which also hasn't been mentioned recently, but they've demoed it before that they can add lifetime to satellites by attaching another satellite to it and giving it a boost in power and fuel. Even this week, we've seen Cygnus XL, also from Northrop, dock with the ISS, so they're supplying refueling through that vehicle to the ISS so they can continue to power. So there's solutions like this. I mean, Europe is talking about building their own space plane with Dassault Aviation and the Vortex. So it seems like the solution for space tugs is more the government working to develop their own top secret space planes that can kind of handle this. Because I think they serve dual purpose. They can move assets around to unique orbits. They can refuel. They can act as space weapons against hostile assets. Right. And these commercial solutions aren't.
Well, the business case isn't there yet. The price, the current business case that is closing, you're saying, are the defense contractors, government agencies who are doing this military spending, which is famous for being some of the least price sensitive customers there exist, willing to just pay for capability. Yeah, price be damned, almost. So it would make perfect sense that the consumer and commercial market wouldn't necessarily have that same level of appetite for cost for a lot of these solutions. So it makes sense that this would stay primarily a defense focused, a government owned industry until we're able to see the business case on the commercial side really start to close.
Yeah, I think for now it's defense and government use case, but you're in competition with these large entrenched space companies that already have solutions. I think the real opportunity is when we start becoming an interplanetary species, and we need more persistent on-orbit assets that need to be maintained and have that sort of autonomous movement and robotic interaction, all that sort of stuff, which might be coming sooner than we think. I mean, Starship's moving along at a very fast rate. I mean, the thing I've seen for Starship is that they can launch one for all the cargo, and then they launch a second for the fuel, and they like dock with each other and transfer the fuel to the cargo one, and that one takes off and the other returns to Earth. So no real infrastructure needed for that solution, which would be great. But once you start having that kind of motion between Earth, Moon, Mars, it opens up the ecosystem for other companies. They'll start putting stuff in orbit around Earth, around Mars,
right,
around the Moon, and those things will need technology to operate them. And I think that's where this kind of use case makes more sense in a commercial stance. But I think right now it's just too early.
Makes sense. I think we're 3 weeks out from Payload's Lunar and Mars Space Economy Summit in Houston. So that'll be a fun one to be at and hear sort of what the conversation around these topics sounds like.
Yeah, that'll be awesome. Some of the technology that's not too early, that's honestly at this point a bit oversaturated, but we're still seeing some interesting stuff come out of it, is Earth observation. It's probably the most common use case for Earth orbiting platforms. We talked a little bit about it last week with SAR, ISI having that large contract and expanding to Japan.
Yeah, big win for them.
Yeah, and we kind of wrote it off as SAR's kind of a rejected use case. Maxar had been talking about how the government was deprioritizing it and not funding it as much. And honestly, they're one of the US companies that uses it the most. But we're seeing international companies start to adopt it even more. This week we saw Echelon. I don't know what language that is, maybe Greek. They announced that they're going to use SAR for a digital twin project for Niantic, which I thought was a really interesting use case for this. Niantic being the company, the gaming company behind Pokemon Go, which was a huge success like 10 years ago now. So they're still around, still making games, and planning to use synthetic aperture radar to create a digital twin of the Earth. So this is a really interesting use case because it kind of gives us the ability to like be creative in our world based on this technology. And Niantic, using augmented reality, can kind of blend it with the space data to create interesting projects. So I'm really curious to see what they kind of do. Having this sort of mingling between technology, space technology, and the creative industry like gaming could be huge. I mean, this is a use case that's not very much explored, but Niantic became huge. I mean, they're multi-billion-dollar company off of one game. So like, how many games does it take before this becomes a billion-dollar industry?
Well, it's not just Niantic. They're not playing in this space entirely alone. Maxar and Ecopia AI actually announced a team up this week as well to build out vector mapping capability. Maxar using some of their RGB and some of their synthetic aperture radar data with Ecopia to help create that sort of digital twin. So there's some momentum in creating these products and solving these problems. It's not just going to be Echelon and Niantic building out these sort of maps and this capability. But it is interesting. One of the challenges with the business case is that there's a lot of customers, a lot of folks who would love 3D accurate, live 3D modeled digital twins of their work sites or sites of interest or what have you. But sort of one of the trends that we see in the Earth observation industry is that for the majority of customers, yesterday's data is just as good as today's data. Yeah. So most folks aren't super excited to pay a premium in order to get the up-to-date data. And so the big question from the business case perspective is like, okay, does this product market fit is it actually persistent? Or are folks going to try and like, okay, great, hey, they've got this digital twin of all of our work sites and all of our assets, and we've got this data set, great. We've purchased the data set, we're good. Or is it going to be more of a, hey, we need this data set and we need to keep this data set up to date, really high fidelity. And so that sort of question as to whether or not these customers are going to stick around, how sticky they're going to be, whether or not they're going to eventually churn, that's one of the big sort of unknowns that we have for the digital twin 3D imaging space. And so that's this partnership and the Maxar partnership both represent pretty strong bets that the customer base is going to be sticky.
Yeah, which then you have to think about, which use cases does require this to continue operating. Like you said, there's very few things that aren't persistent on Earth that are changing frequently enough to need a constant ingestion of this radar data. For games, it is an interesting thought that Niantic, which pretty much pioneered augmented reality gaming for the phone, blended technology with our real world and allowed us to like interact with it in a new way. That could very well happen with synthetic aperture radar. I don't know why it makes me think of like Burning Man, but the fact that like people can build giant things very quickly and kind of see it show up on Earth through this digital twin is kind of a neat concept. I mean, obviously buildings take years to make, so that kind of change is not happening at the rate at which SAR becomes like a needed resource. But yeah, it's still helpful. I think it's helpful for city planning, which is where a lot of like the elevation data is useful. And I think most of the argument for combat readiness is just that for urban warfare, having an up-to-date mapping of a city, especially when it's being bombed and buildings are being leveled and elevation and layouts are changing constantly, like that's when these things are handy. But until that happens, kind of just sitting there.
I mean, it could be another defense first product line where the similar to sort of the tugging industry, it could just be another product line where there's a small number of customers for whom this data is priceless, and for everybody else, like, hey, we're kind of fine using last year's images, last year's 3D model for this, but for defense, U.S. allies, what have you, it could be a very different story for anybody looking to purchase this data for national security purposes.
Yeah, and I know last week I was talking about how it's curious that ISI is doing well in like Finland and Japan because they're close. And my theory is they're close to Russia. They're much more close to striking distance of weapons that could destroy their cities, and they're very urban, or they're very they have a lot of big cities. I mean,
right,
this is more useful for them. U.S. is not within striking distance of really anyone. We could deploy it to international activities, but there might just not be enough value there.
Well, thankfully, we're such good friends with Telesat that we don't have to worry about them. But I think, I think to your point, yeah, absolutely. I mean, SAR has been for a while now used to try and identify military assets in the field, to identify where they're going, what they're doing, and to provide as accurate and up-to-date information as possible. And so I think very much to your point that it's not at all a far leap to imagine that a lot of the fit that we're seeing for ISI in Finland and Japan are that Finland and Japan both feel some pressure to up their national security, national defense spending. And I think the fact that ISI is a Finnish company is also probably helping with that. But very, very valid, valid theory.
They only recently joined NATO. So I mean, it would be a European asset at that point. Well, I guess it is because they've already launched several SAR satellites.
Right.
No, I mean, the other use case for these kind of things is, natural disasters, which I love those use cases. They rarely make much money. We should still pursue them anyway, but a lot of that comes from governments to be able to pursue it. I mean, the reason they don't make money is like the kind of people that respond to natural disasters don't have a lot of money to spend, and we can't project when the natural disasters are going to happen.
Right.
There's still really cool use cases for this technology. I mean, SAR is being shown that it can be used for earthquakes, not for necessarily for the detection of them, but for the measurement after, to kind of see how stuff moves. So this is a perfect instance of something very large moving very quickly and needing a quick update on all of that. So, NASA has been running experiments through JPL using a Japanese SAR satellite, the ALOS 2. So Japan is they're not new to this SAR game. ISI isn't bringing over new technology. They've been doing this for a while. And NASA's been able to show that, SAR is very good at measuring tectonic shifts. So they're able to see how Earth's plates move after an earthquake. And they're looking to expand this with NISAR, which is supposed to be launching next year.
NISAR is launching next year?
Yeah.
Wow.
I know. I've heard that name around for a while. And
wow.
Finally
going up.
Yeah, knock on wood.
Well,
It sounds like it's going to be one of the most
our little
advanced.
project is all grown up. That's
I
fabulous.
know. How many people it took down to get here. But
The
yeah,
path is strewn with former engineers who've worked on NISAR
yeah,
and did not survive. But
yeah,
that's a fun one to see go up. That'll be great.
yeah. I feel like it's the first synthetic aperture radar for NASA, but I have a hard time believing that's true. Anyway, NISAR is going to be a useful domestic asset for NASA to continue running these synthetic aperture radar experiments, and yeah, just do more projects with it. I mean, it's a great satellite. It's great to see satellites go up for these environmental efforts, or seeing it with other satellites doing different things, but still helping with Earth projection of disasters and recovery from disasters.
Sure.
NOAA just awarded $35 million to Planet IQ and Spire for radio occultation weather measurements. This is a use case we don't see very often. I mean, I think the point that they picked these two is because these are pretty much the only two that do it. It's a very unique use of radio. You're basically measuring the distortion of the radio signal through the atmosphere, and that tells you, water presence, density, wind, things like this. So instead of just like looking at a cloud, which can't tell you much, so it's not Earth observation mission. It is a radio RF mission. This is a very novel way of detecting weather, and one that scales very well across a fleet if they need to deploy more and give us more frequent updates on weather.
Nice.
Some other companies are still also doing environmental assistance through satellites, but in the Earth imaging domain. GHGSat has been around for a while, but they just raised $34 million to continue tracking methane using an interferometer. And this
was that a fundraise or a contract award? I remember reading that they had received funding from the Department of Energy.
Won $34 million. Yeah, Department of Energy, which is very interesting that the Department of Energy would pay GHGSat at the same time that I believe it's the Department of Agriculture might be the same department, honestly, they're removing the self-reporting requirements for oil and gas providers to report how much methane they're producing. So
interesting.
Not great, but hopefully GHGSat can counter some of that. They have shown great success in the past with their technology. So hopefully this $34 million goes a long way for them to scale up, and hopefully keep some of these methane producers accountable, because it's a huge problem. And if these companies aren't self-reporting, there's no incentive for them to not do it. So those are all the big stories for this week, ones that we want to discuss. There's quite a few, other things that came up that are cool to highlight. They're a bit either too early in their cycle to have much to talk about, or just kind of out of sync with the industry in general. But nevertheless, they're really cool to think about and to learn about. First up is Venus Space. They've added a former astronaut that was testing for SpaceX Falcon to their board. Venus Space is a rotating detonation rocket engine company, one of the only ones I've ever heard of. This technology,
so cool.
I know, it's one of my favorite technologies. It's just such a neat idea. In concept, it's just a rotary engine, but in practice, it's a much more powerful rotary engine that just the exhaust provides your thrust. So This thing's awesome. It's been stuck in development for decades. Pretty much as long as the space industry has been around, it's been in development. DARPA's been stuck on the last kind of mile solution for this. I've seen other areas like JAXA had a rotating detonation rocket engine test a few years ago, but it was only at test scales. Venus Space is also at test scales. So there's a possibility that this thing just doesn't scale to the size that's needed. But the technology itself is really cool. it just takes controlled explosions to rotate. It uses controlled explosions to create the exhaust to power the rocket instead of just a constant firing of thrust. Which that constant firing is usually the big problem with liquid bipropellant rockets, is keeping that going without some sort of cavitation or backflow or anything like that is really difficult, especially when you're like landing a rocket and there's a bunch of air coming back into your nozzle as you're trying to thrust. So
fluid dynamics are a deal breaker more often than not.
Yeah, but this rocket doesn't really care. It just keeps exploding, and as long as it just keeps going, it keeps providing thrust. Most of the challenges with the fact that you were exploding something inside of your rocket. So vibrations were not great. Materials were not great. Venus Space has said they've solved all what they said 3 problems. They didn't say what the 3rd problem was, which was a subject for my research later, because I'm very interested in knowing what they're doing. But I really hope they're successful. A rotating detonation rocket engine would be awesome, especially as we're talking about other launch providers coming up to compete with SpaceX. An RDRE, for context, if scaled to like SpaceX size provider, it's 15% more efficient with fuel. And so we actually see a quadrupling of payload capacity, which would be awesome. Right. Not just for like capability and size and all of that, but also just we get to use less fuel. So I like being environmentally friendly. There's very few solutions for that for rocket launches out there, and this one seems to be one of the biggest ones I've heard of.
There's a couple of new rocket launch capability plays that are focused much more intently on the environmental fuel efficiency of things. A couple of hybrid launch companies out there that are making some really good progress. But you're very much hitting on a concern that the industry is aware of.
Yeah,
so we would love to see Venus Space be one of these players who winds up getting their feet set and winning effectively.
Yeah, I mean the only other ones I've seen approaching this kind of problem are like single stage to orbit solutions, which are even more difficult, if not impossible, to implement than an RDRE, surprisingly. There's some companies doing it, like Reaction Engines in the UK, but there's been very little progress, and nobody's gotten to a solution besides maybe Virgin Orbital. But we've seen how well their business does with that. So hopefully this is a better solution.
Hopefully. Also in the news recently, Astro Digital announced a contract to get power from the Starcatcher orbital power grid in what amounts to a solar panel reflector and magnifying glass treatment on orbit. The Starcatcher orbital power grid is effectively going to collect and transfer via concentrated light the UV and solar energy to existing solar reflectors and solar panel systems on Astro Digital's space assets. So totally works without any need for retrofit. Effectively they're just turning the sun on to wherever the solar panels for these orbital assets are. A simple solution on paper that they've wound up solving, and that's a promising development for some of the additional infrastructure that we need to see in space. We've not yet seen any sort of on-orbit power network. And so the Starcatcher power grid represents the first step in that vein.
Yeah, we have
a lot of possibilities.
We have seen some demos for it. Starcatcher themselves have done a demo already for space to Earth power transmission.
Right.
Caltech's also done demos with their system, but that one actually collects the energy, stores it, and then transmits it through microwave to ground. So Starcatcher's approach to use optical relays to just focus and transfer this solar power directly without having that loss over conversion to electricity, conversion to RF, all that sort of stuff is super cool. If they can get the system to work, even just for on orbit, like providing astrodigital, that's huge. If they can get it to work for the ground, that's even bigger. I mean, it would be awesome to see. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about attenuation through atmosphere and having to counter that refraction. So I think getting this to scale for Earth applications is going to be a whole other problem than getting this to work for satellites. But if astrodigital thinks they can really make this work for a satellite, that's awesome. Getting power on a satellite while you're in eclipse is huge. I mean, you'd effectively be doubling your power. It enables your payload, makes your satellite smaller, makes your launch costs cheaper. There's lots of cascading effects if this technology works.
The other big development that we saw was IonQ signed an MOU for an in-space demo, and they're effectively looking at building out some quantum computing. It looks like they've been effectively vertically integrating so that they're trying to own the entirety of the supply chain from manufacture to launch of an orbital quantum compute asset. They purchased Cubitek quantum networking for their quantum networking capabilities. Earlier in January, they purchased Capella Space for their synthetic aperture radars satellite capabilities earlier in May. And so now IonQ has the capability to build out an entirety of a quantum computing and quantum communications network on orbit, which we have yet to see. It should be really interesting as this quantum communication represents something that is going to be different and more challenging to jam, meaning that we could theoretically see this prove to be a solution for the contested communications problem set effectively.
Yeah, I mean, this is really cool technology. We mostly hear about quantum technology on the Earth. Very rarely do we hear it in space. The last time I've seen this done was in 2017 with the Mikius satellite. China was able to quantumly teleport an entangled photon from the ground to a satellite. So this kind of quantum teleportation has been done before. The other type of quantum applications that we've been hearing about are quantum encryption. So you encrypt on board, you transfer it to the ground. It entails entangling of the particles, but if it's ever touched and transferred, the whole thing gets scrambled and it's useless. So being able to interfere with that is very difficult. All the traditional RF interference technology that hostile actors would want to use, useless against this. So it really is, for lack of a better term, a quantum leap in how we communicate between our satellites and Earth. And it has huge implications for defense. I'm not so sure what it would mean for the telecoms industry commercially. We don't have ground resources that can really interact with quantum on any scale. So getting it to that point is going to still be a challenge. But, tackling this first part of actually implementing quantum on space, not just a demo like China did a decade ago, will be awesome. And this is a lot of money for them to get on that.
Yeah. I mean, in the immediate future, the fact that there is no way to communicate with or potentially interfere with quantum networking and quantum communications, that's 100% going to be a selling point of the entire product stack. So it'll be interesting to see what that sort of, I'll say, adversarial or contested product development looks like. GPS jamming is well known, well understood, well commoditized. It'll be interesting to see once this new form and type of communication network starts to hit the market, how people are going to try to interfere with or to set back that communication network. And it'll be interesting to see how that winds up affecting the defense sector, where I think we're probably going to see this demand play out first.
So in other news this week, there's been quite a few funding raises. Messium, they won a 4.5 million in seed funding to work on their farm fertilizer management. I believe this is an Earth observation company that's using hyperspectral imagery to look for nitrogen in soil.
I believe so. We've spoken about Kai Labs and GHGSat as well, winning the 67 million and the 35 million USD respectively. There was also the Hubble Network raise. They closed a 70 million Series B to continue building out their Bluetooth tracking constellation of satellites. And in addition to those, I think there was a Black Sky contract. I think Black Sky won a $24 million NGO contract to track some environmental changes, and then another noteworthy raise of 6.1 million, I think, seed for Icarus to build out on-orbit robotics capabilities. Well, that's all for us this week at the Space Times podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, I'm Paul Mayer. With me is Harrison Lambert. And we were excited to talk about some of the big trends that we've seen this week in the industry. We look forward to chatting with you again next week. Until then.